Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. And there was a brief technical hitch there due to the fact that the OBS system I used to stream through had decided that my camera wasn't attached, even though it was. So here we are, and rather than tea tonight, in a drastic departure from the norm, we have a cup of coffee on the go, due to the fact that it's been a rather long day, and therefore the energy is required to provide satisfactory energy levels on the air, I think is the requisite phrase to use there. So I'm just going to be advertising this stream in the various relevant locations. The previous one had to be shut down, as I said, due to a catastrophic technical failure. I am investigating the possibility of doing this in the future through Rumble's studio system, but I think for now we may stick with just having the multiple streamed through the multiple use software, which is provides me with the opportunity to stream to 3 platforms rather than just one. So be sure to avail yourselves of the various different other platforms that we have, such as Odyssey and Rumble, of course. And I keep saying I'm going to do something on Telegram Live and not getting around to it, so that will happen relatively soon. So tonight we are going to be covering the musical chairs in Kiev and what the final removal of Zaluzny and the appointment of General Syrski, a man who is essentially a Russian. So that's a rather interesting one. I mean, talk about, it's almost as if Zelensky saw the Putin interview and thought, you know what, I'll prove his point by appointing a guy who went through the Soviet military academy back in Moscow in the middle 80s and who was an officer in the Red Army artillery units, served in the Soviet armed forces in Afghanistan, and was probably, though not certainly, but was probably a member of the CPSU back then. So that's a rather interesting detail, though of course the CPSU, by the time the 80s rolled around, contained many different characters, including most members of the current Russian political leadership, a lot of members of the Russian military leadership, who certainly aren't communists then or now, and of course quite a lot of members of the post-2014 Ukrainian leadership, including former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, who was a member of the Ukrainian section of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union back in the late 1980s. A very enthusiastic member of it, of course, as he's been enthusiastic about every single twist and turn in Ukrainian political history, and made sure to put himself on the winning side of all of them, due to the fact that he's a consummate opportunist and nothing else. Right, we'll be getting to that in just a moment, but for then we will therefore quickly go through some technical details. Due to the relative success of streaming at 10:30 last week on a regular basis, every night last week, I have looked at various things and decided that the best way to do this, to leave no stone unturned, no audience without a live stream, is to alternate between live streams which start at 7:30 and live streams which start at 10:30. So the live stream tonight is a 7:31. Tomorrow night is 10:30. So tomorrow we'll be covering Israel and Gaza at 10:30 English time. And then on Tuesday, we're back to 7:30 again. And that's going to be yet another, I know you've all been looking forward to this one, investigation into Russian political economy, or more specifically the political economy of modern Russia. Because the more, the greater my ability to search into Russian articles and Russian communist and Marxist articles in particular, the more I turn up or that is of interest. Now, I was challenged following my stream last week about why Russia is not an imperialist country to go further with that, and I was challenged to read an article on a website called Politsturm, an article I have now read, and basically it's a load of ultra-left Trotskyite tripe. But as I was very politely asked to read it and respond to it, I therefore will read it and respond to it. So you can look forward to Tuesday evening, 7:30 GMT. Put this one in your diaries. It will be an examination of the Politsturm article, which I will post on the Telegram group, and its claims and my refutation of it. So Politsturm, if you're not aware, are apparently a Marxist organization who claim to be communists from the Russian Federation. Who knows, of course, who they actually are. The internet is a very strange place, and spies abound, but there you go. So I will be responding to their critique, Politsturm's critique, on Tuesday at 7:30. And then on Wednesday, we'll be back with a regular news show, and that'll be a 10:30 show. Thursday, I'm on the road, so that's also going to be a 10:30 show. And depending upon where I've got to in my travels, it may be a show that streams entirely from my phone. So be prepared for that one. And on Friday, we'll be back to 7:30 start. And then we'll be doing the long-promised and only now delivered upon show upon the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and its implications. So that will probably be a 2-hour program starting at 7:30, and that will cover the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, Marx's theory of value, which of course is inspired by but developed from the work of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and be looking at the theory that Marx put forward himself, modern day interpretations of it, etc. So that's the next few days coming up on the program. And if you haven't already done so, be sure to like the stream and share it around, and also be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And with that, we are ready to go. So, first things first, let's greet those who are in the chat. We have Will Johnson, who says, cup of tea? No, cup of coffee. We have Terry Eaton, my comrade from the Class Consciousness Project. We have Peter, who is joining us from the land that will always be known as Perfidious Albion. And by the way, British tourists, banned from North Korea. DPRK doesn't want us. And you know what? I don't blame them. Have you seen us when we go abroad? Jesus. I wouldn't want us in their country. Though I must say, I may have to apply for special dispensation for a Marx Engels Lenin Institute meetup in Pyongyang. Perhaps with the amount of times I've had pro-DPRK spokespeople on the program, they will give us special dispensation, and maybe I can claim Irish ancestry on my mother's side and get away with it that way. I think most comrades I know can claim Irish ancestry, or perhaps, given that a lot of us live in the northwest, perhaps Welsh ancestry, and claim that you have a long-term political project to undo the union of Wales and England and the work of the imperialist Edward I. Maybe that'll get us in. Right, DE, who says, hello from the wilds of Hampshire. Lee Hinchcliffe, good evening to you. Otis, good evening to you. Carmo, good evening to you. And Gonzalo, same to you. Isidore, and Dan Lindstrom, who's joining us from Sweden. And Jay, hello to you out in Norfolk, Virginia. President Jesus in the land of Gavin Newsom. Maybe President Newsom before too long. And Red Star Betty, good evening to you up there in Durham. Muzzle Paint, solidarity to you. Rob, who says, hello everyone, joining with Beans, and good to have you with us, even though, of course, you're all from the wrong side of the Pennines. And Tim Gray's watching AC Milan versus Napoli at the same time. Hey, well, I'm a better commentator on a football match I'm not even watching than anybody on Sky. Comrade Hello Hi, who says, hey, comrades. George, salute to you. The time is alternating. See the Telegram group and the previous announcement. We've got a guy said who's calling himself, or assume it's a dude, maybe it's not. I am making assumptions there. Royalist in exile. Good evening to you in Norway. Interesting name. Lertis, who says, good evening from Engels City, Manchester District. Well, good to have somebody else here from the Greater Manchester region. Frank, who says hello from California. And we've got Comrade Hello Hi, of course, from the East Anglia People's Republic. Decent demonstration out yesterday in Manchester. For the purposes of Palestine solidarity, decent but not reaching the levels it was at back in November of last year. Of course, the relentlessness of the Israeli campaign, and of course the relentless ignoring of all demonstrations by the government in Britain, has of course somewhat ground down opinion here. People are still angry about it, but the government's tactic of just ignoring every demonstration and pretending it's not happening is usually a pretty good one from their point of view. As I've said before, things will need to escalate in a different direction if the government's going to be seriously challenged. And Irish Partisan, good evening to you, our comrade in Minsk. Good to have you with us. Right, so let's get to the meat of the issue this evening, which is, of course, the power struggles in Kiev. Zelensky finally sacks Zaluzny and appoints a man who is essentially Russian in his place. As I said earlier in the program, he appoints General Alexander Syrsky, who not only went to the old Soviet military academy, now the Russian military academy in Moscow. He, of course, served in the Red Army, was an officer in an artillery unit. Not only that, but his parents, still alive and both live in Russia, as does his brother, as does, I believe, his son, all of whom support the special military operation and all of whom have denounced him. So quite why he's still in Ukraine serving the Banderist regime, I'm not sure, but it does point to something rather interesting, if of course tragic, that this is in many ways another reminder, of course, of the implosion, the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, which, of course, as Putin stated the other day, the Yeltsin leadership of Russia took the lead in carrying out, with the active assistance of Kravchuk from Ukraine and Shukevich from Belarus. All men who are now, of course, deservedly buried, though not before time. And, of course, interestingly enough, the man who is more responsible probably than any other single individual for all of this chaos and death, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, long may he roast in the fires of hell if indeed there is one, he died as soon as the military operation began, which is very apt because in many ways it's the sort of final grisly act of his blood-soaked, horrendous legacy. Of course, liberals in the West still go weak at the knees at the sight of Gorbachev's memory, but of course, we know the reason for that. So Syrsky is now the general in overall charge of the Ukrainian armed forces, though that, I would argue, is a poisoned chalice, distinctly. Though I am reminded of the fact that something Putin said that in his interview with Tucker Carlson the other day that did come back to me, which is that he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing him here, that no one in the Russian leadership, in the Yeltsin clique, actually thought that it would ever matter that they were, just in that they converted things to the CIS and that they were now a separate country from Ukraine. And you can understand that clique's point of view in a way. Because if you look at a figure like Petro Poroshenko, to return to this wretched creature for a moment, this guy and the various other oligarchs in Ukraine, other than those who were mainly interested in an exclusive relationship with the West, most of them had very extensive business interests in Russia. And it's not only that they did that, but they were also on very familiar terms with the Russian comprador clique as well. So these were two ruling classes that emerged out of the counter-revolution of 1991 that were interrelated to each other for financial reasons, and the gap between them was never too much. I mean, you had the games played by Leonid Kuchma in the 90s and the 2000s, and others, flirting with Banderism. You had the games being indulged in by the Americans in Ukraine. But the point of view expressed by Putin that no one ever thought it would matter is an interesting one, because I think it gives away probably more than he intended to, which is that for all that the shouting and the screaming from the Banderas to the Americans were funding extensively in Ukraine all the way, well, going back to World War II actually, but certainly since the early 90s. The fact that they were rebuilding the Bandera cult under Yushchenko, the fact that there was even steps towards that by the corrupt old crook who's somehow still alive, I think, Kuchma, in the 90s. Again, a former member of the CPSU and an industrial manager in the time of the Soviet Union. It never looked like it would matter to the Russian ruling class because they were still doing business with people like Poroshenko, no problem at all. And so it's difficult to imagine. I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a regular Ukrainian now who didn't want anything to do with the Maidan, but who had lived for a quarter of a century in a Ukraine where the borderline between Ukraine and Russia was very loose, even though Ukraine's political establishment had tied itself to an ever greater degree to US imperialism. That for a while mustn't have made all that much of an impact on the ability of Ukrainians who had families spread across the border to travel between the two. It's only really after 2014 that it started to actually matter, when the war began. Started, of course, by Syrsky's bosses in Kiev, by Poroshenko and co. But it even started before him. Poroshenko, of course, reflecting his class position, promised to bring peace and then was told, no, that's not the agenda. And being an opportunist, he adapted to that. But it must have seemed to the average Ukrainian that this was something that was just a passing thing. They'd been through Yushchenko and then got back to Yanukovych again. So perhaps it seemed like nothing was really going to change. But it certainly is the change now. The change has very much come. And so people like Syrsky, who's a Russian who spent his entire career, his career in the Ukrainian military began as a Red Army soldier based in Ukraine. It's interesting to see how a man like that would have justified it to himself, what's happened. But we're trying to get into the mind of somebody else now, and that's always a rather difficult thing to do. However, in charge he is of a gigantic mess, which is that the front all the way up and down the 1,000 miles plus or so that it runs is under extreme pressure everywhere. If you look at even the the various different maps from various different channels, some pro-Ukrainian, some pro-Russian, all of which would agree that there is only really one army on the offensive, and that is, of course, the Russians. And they are, of course, mainly focused at the moment, it would seem, on Avdiivka and a couple of other places. And this pocket that they are closing around Avdiivka is slowly closing. With more and more intense bombing and military activity, they've left the Ukrainians essentially, from the map I can look at, and I look at the pro-Ukrainian live UA map, there's essentially now one road out that isn't controlled by the Russians, and that's a very, seems to be quite a minor road. You can't get out any other way. Of course, you can go across various fields and open country, but given the saturation level at which drones are being operated inside Ukraine by both Ukraine and Russia, but certainly now the Russians seem to have an advantage in this area, then it's increasingly the case that you can't escape anywhere unless, of course, you travel by night. And even then, if you try and retreat without authorization, there's a fair chance that the Nazis are going to fucking kill you. So there's an awful lot of men being trapped there. Now, this brings us back to the role of Sersky. Sersky, I mean, his appointment was greeted with apparent alarm by some elements in Europe and the British bourgeois press. He's been talked about as a typical Soviet general, which is gibberish, by the way. I mean, the more you start learning about Soviet military techniques and the way that Soviet armies were commanded in World War II and afterwards, you can see that the way in which the Anthony Beaver school of history, and if you don't know who Anthony Beaver is, he's a guy who writes like official histories for the British ruling class. So he writes like anti-communist history. He's written a virulently anti-communist book on the Spanish Civil War, where mainly he spends his time bigging up the anarchists and attacking the communists, even though, of course, he's not an anarchist, he's a British reactionary. The Stalingrad book, which is a disgraceful misrepresentation of history, an absolute propaganda job from start to finish, accuses the Russians basically of relying on mass human wave attacks, completely ignores all the developments in Russian military, or Soviet, I should say, military science all the way through the 1930s, the sophisticated tactics used by people like Marshal Zhukov, Konev, Vasilevsky, and others who commanded the victories on the Eastern Front. Just basically puts it down to persistence and usage of mass numbers to basically charge in to the German machine guns and clog them up with bodies. And of course he repeats the lie about the NKVD standing behind the lines with a gun to everybody's head, and that's why the Russians fought so hard. This is all, of course, bollocks, and it's very easy to establish that it's bollocks if you care to venture into the world of like Russian historical sources, even anti-communist ones, who will go into the information required in much greater depth and with much greater truth than someone like Beaver obviously does, who's just out to do an anti-communist hit job. He did another one called Berlin 1945, where he repeats a load of unsubstantiated rumors. If you go into the footnotes in that, you can see that a lot of his story about the mass rapes carried out allegedly by the Red Army in Berlin were based on rumor and hearsay and speculation that came out long after the war. So again, like if you're writing anti-communist so-called history of the school of Robert Conquest, you can basically make a nice living for yourself as a so-called historian, writing complete gibberish and getting away with it. Indeed, Beaver is acclaimed, the late unlamented Robert Conquest, friend, by the way, of Christopher Hitchens, was of course acclaimed by the US imperialists and George W. Bush in particular, who gave him, I think, the Congressional Medal of Freedom. Was it? No, it was either the Congressional Medal of Honor or was it the Presidential Medal of Freedom? It's one of the two that he was given. And of course, why wouldn't he be? He was a propagandist for the American ruling class for 70 odd years. To return, though, to the question of Sersky. Sersky is called, he's a typical Soviet commander. The Soviets just use these like mass human wave tactics. It's essentially a Mongol horde without horses. So it's all nonsense. It's all garbage. And as soon as anybody starts talking that way to you, you know you're dealing with either an idiot or a propagandist who's never looked at any Soviet military history at all, and who's just swallowed the Anthony Beaver line full stop. So Sersky, though, and the Ukrainians indeed were using those kind of tactics or similar kind of tactics, but those weren't something that they got from the Soviet Union. This is something that they've got straight out of, apparently NATO training, though in reality it's like a sort of bastardization of the stereotype of a old Soviet tactic, especially in Bakhmut or Artemovsk, depending upon which name you prefer, where on the orders of Zelensky, but also, let's be clear, along the lines of the wishes of the NATO commanders themselves, the Artemovsk or Bakhmut operation, which cost tens of thousands, at least 40,000 Ukrainian dead and wounded, apparently, if you believe the numbers that have come out, It was Syrski's operation, though it must be said under the explicit orders of Zelensky, not one step back, hold everything. Zaluzny let it be known that he didn't agree with this. But, of course, NATO's, or more accurately, the US imperialists and their European hostages, vassals, allies, take your pick of words there, they're the ones who've been designing this war. They designed the entirety of the so-called counteroffensive in late May and June of last year. So, are we seriously saying they had nothing to do with this Artemovsk offensive? Maybe, maybe not. I would say that it's certainly the case that they denounced it or let it be known that they didn't want anything to do with it after it had finished. Remember, though, Zelensky in Christmas 2022 stood in Congress talking on and on about how we will win, we will carry on this great battle. Look, here's a flag, Nancy Pelosi, from the heroic defenders of Bakhmut. Bakhmut will never fall, blah, 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 blah. But this is the reality, that they were all told by Zelensky and others that we've got it. We're never going to let it go. And of course, it fell in the end, as it was always going to. Ultimately, the cost was probably prohibitively high on the Russian side as well, which is a part of what led to the falling out between the Ministry of Defense and the leadership of the Wagner organization, at least the nominal leadership of it led by Prigozhin, though he vastly overestimated his influence in the end. So Syrski's name is on that failure, and it was a failure. Zaluzny, well, let it be known that he was opposed to it, though how opposed he really was to any of this is another matter. Everybody in Ukraine is, in the Ukrainian hierarchy, is double dealing each other, I think. So his name's on that. Now his name will be on this Avdiivka cauldron as well. So this is another disaster in the making. But again, this comes from the orders of Zelensky. Zelensky keeps ordering not one step back. So one has to ask, well, why? We need to examine the motivations of the various different characters involved here, because the story that Zaluzny and his supporters in the Ukrainian media are putting out are that he favoured going on the defensive. He's talked about this in rather elliptical terms in the interviews he did with Time magazine. Even back over Christmas of 2022, he was talking about that they might need to surrender. So I think Zaluzny is certainly somebody who's been playing double games for a long time. I've said before that I think he was probably the guy who the Russians had in mind when they were looking at the Ukrainian general staff potentially switching sides. Remember, when they announced the beginning of the special military operation, they did expect somebody very senior in the Ukrainian military hierarchy to switch sides. Putin basically said as much. So who was it? My interpretation is I think it was probably Zaluzny. I think a guy like that seemed, I think he was probably playing both sides of the coin, but seems to have got cold feet or not. Things didn't quite work out in the way that he hoped. And, of course, then he doubles down on his great allegiance to Banderism and all things right sector, etc., etc. But that always struck me as a massive overcompensation. So, but anyway, he is gone, and Syrsky is nominally in charge now. There's been apparently a purge in the military hierarchy with the supporters of Zaluzny got rid of. But, of course, these are all the commanders who have any experience fighting or planning and executing plans on the front line. Though again, how much the Ukrainian commanders actually have influence over the battle plans and how much these are just dictated to them by the US, British, French and German officers is another question. I mean, we don't know exactly yet how much of the day-to-day operations are dictated by the NATO officer corps. We know that they designed the disastrous summer offensive on the basis of, it would appear, wishful thinking and fantasies. The fantasies that the Russian army would just quit and run away, the fantasies that the Putin government would just crumble. Again, they've had that fantasy for a long, long time now, going all the way back to arguably 2004, probably, given that Putin's correct assertion that they were involved in funding and arming the insurgency, the terrorist campaign of the various Chechen Ishkarian groups in the early 2000s. So they've had this fantasy for a long time, and this fantasy formed the basis of the summer offensive, which Syrskyi also had his name on. So they're getting rid of commanders with experience. Zaluzny has apparently been offered the deputy ambassador post in London, presumably so he can come over here and hang out with Boris Johnson. I don't know. Who issued a hilarious video the other day where he was babbling on and going, "Tucker Carlson's a bally traitor. Oh my God, lies, all of it lies." Because he's getting worried now because he knows that he's been caught out. There's suddenly over 100 million people have seen Putin very calmly and clearly spell out that Boris Johnson was the errand boy to Kiev. And now millions of people, I'd say a good few million in this country who didn't know that before, at least now they have the question in their minds about it. And especially now as the so-called economy in Britain is staggering towards a recession, and you've got politicians from the Labour Party like Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer going on about tough choices to come, and probably going to be citing, as the Tories have done, the Ukraine war and why that's we need to carry on funding it, even though we've got tough choices at home. And by the way, tough choices always means tough for you. The toughness is for you. The choice is for them. That's the division. And they'll be citing all this stuff about the Ukraine war if it now gets to be more popularly known that one of the reasons why this war is carried on, not the sole reason, of course, is the actions of Johnson being the errand boy for the White House, which is all he was, by the way. He didn't take that decision on his own. He wouldn't have the authority to take that, to commit the United States and all the European countries to the backing of Ukraine as their chosen proxy. Would have taken the agreement of the American president. And we all know that Mr. My memory's so bad I let you speak Biden probably gave that permission and would have done whether he was compos mentis or not. So is this likely to revive Ukrainian fortunes is the question. And the answer, of course, has to be a resounding no. It doesn't matter to who you put in charge. You could put Napoleon himself in charge of the Ukrainian army right now. It wouldn't make a damn bit of difference. The fact is that they are now having to mobilize more and more people who are unsuited for military service. They have been doing for a long time. They're talking about building a whole new army from scratch. But bear in mind, look what happened to the army they built from scratch, which they sent in on the offensive back in late May, early June. It got annihilated. And by the way, now they have even less air defense. The Russians have been targeting their air defense relentlessly. So now they have even less of a chance of targeting Russian missiles, Russian drones, and of course the Russian Air Force, which is acting with almost complete impunity now across the territories being contested in old eastern Ukraine, new western Russia. So what the hell is Syrskyi going to do? Other than loyally carry out the orders of his commander-in-chief without question, which is something that, of course, Zaluzny, with his continual grumbling to the Western media and building himself up a profile, which Zelensky clearly thought was going to end with Zaluzny going for the top job himself, and that's probably why he's been fired. So he's got himself a man in there who will just do what he's told. And the only difference it will make is it will probably end up costing even more Ukrainian dragooned men their lives. I think this is another stage of the slow unraveling of the Zelensky regime. And once Zelensky goes, it's all over. Like, even if they attempt to parachute back in Petro Poroshenko, even if they attempt to bring in someone like Timoshenko, another complete crook, also somebody who I think I'm right in saying was born in Soviet Armenia, despite the Ukrainian folk hairstylings. Um, the result will be the same, and it is, again, I will re-emphasize the whole purpose of this merry dance or bloody dance that the American imperialists are engaged in now is just trying to avoid having to bargain. They just want the war to continue. Now, there were rumours, of course, that they wanted to put Budanov in charge and move to a terrorist campaign. But if you do that suddenly, then it will look like, and indeed become, a complete collapse. What I suspect is happening now, and again, I'm basing this purely on a reading of the insider sort of leak channels coming out of Ukraine. So Legitimny, Resident, etc., a couple of others, reports that I've seen on the Slavyangrad channel. You look at the scope of things coming out of Ukraine. If it looks like there's going to be a sudden collapse, there's a chance of this becoming like a domino effect. If suddenly units start pulling out, there might be a dramatic collapse in morale. So if they try to move over into a insurgency campaign too quickly, then it's going to cause problems for them, and they're going to look like they've lost. And the one thing that the American imperialists don't want right now is to look like they've lost. So the chances are, and there's a lot of talk coming out of the Americans that they didn't want Syrskyi. I think Syrskyi's a stopgap figure. I think he actually does serve the purposes of the American imperialists quite well, in that he will continue to throw men, and now women, at the front lines. He will continue to try and hold every single patch of ground on those front lines, loyally carrying out the orders of Zelensky, who is, of course, merely a puppet of the US and the British, principally. And as Syrskyi sacrifices thousands and thousands of Ukrainian lives, this will be for the purpose of just prolonging the war to the point where they can switch over to the Lvov government and the Lvov administration, and then switch to a new front line reinforced in the west, and then it'll be an insurgency campaign, terrorism. Syrskyi's job, I think, is to just prolong this frontline fighting for as long as he possibly can, while they prepare to build up their enclave in the west. I think that the more serious NATO military people know very well that it's all over, that they can't possibly regain any ground, that the chances of regime change in Russia are practically zero. That what they've done over the past 2 years is that they've actually flushed most of their best assets in Russia in terms of possible regime change options down the toilet. Not that they were particularly great anyway. A bunch of despised exiled oligarchs, or the double agent, possible triple agent Navalny. None of those are popular figures. So they know that none of their objectives are going to be met now. It's just a question of delaying the inevitable, and that's all Syrskyi's job is, to come in and delay the inevitable. And that makes him a miserable, contemptible figure, because he knows very well that they can't possibly win. And then he'll carry on this war anyway, despite the fact that his entire family has denounced him. And I don't know what he's getting out of this, a giant paycheck, a villa in Miami, who knows what motivates a man. But that, I think, is the job here. He's been appointed because he will do the job of throwing men into the firing line to hold the front lines for as long as possible at whatever cost. And then once that's been done, they've set up this new regime in Lvov in the west, that will be Ukraine Mark II, or perhaps Mark III at this stage. And that will then be declared to be a member of the European Union and NATO, and the Europeans and the American imperialists will declare that they've won. They've lost 3/4 of Ukraine, They've caused the deaths of 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 Ukrainians, and probably by that stage about, what, 60 to 70 odd thousand Russians at the very least. So it's not looking particularly good, and it's looking as cynical and brutal as ever, in my opinion. Right, okay, let's get in with the chat here. Okay, Otis says, George Galloway is doing that well in his campaign. Labour aren't putting any candidates up. They fear they will lose. Well, they did put a candidate up, and then I read on, is it Squawk Box today, that they basically had to purged him because he'd made anti-Israel statements. Which, of course, if you're a Muslim politician in Britain anywhere, you can't run being anything less than anti-Israel. You can't. I mean, maybe in some like weird enclaves somewhere, there's like some compradors. I mean, I know, for instance, there's people who are nominally Muslim, Iranian compradors who I've met, Iranian monarchists who you run into from time to time who are pro-Israel, pro-US, basically like, Iranian Banderists or something, who would happily see their own country turned into a giant pile of bloody rubble, as long as they could be the ones sat on the top of the heap when it was done. So there's maybe those, but there's not many Iranian monarchists running for the British Parliament, as far as I know. So if you're a Pakistani origin or a Bangladeshi Muslim or from North Africa or the Middle East, and that's where your family's from, and you're running for office in the northwest of England, which is where this by-election is taking place, in Rochdale, just up the road from here, well, then you can't be pro-Israel. You've got to make anti-Israel statements. So the Labour Party chose their candidate, and unless these people are completely stupid, they would have known very well that this guy will have made anti-Israel statements, especially over the last 3 months. And then, of course, the Daily Mail just does a quick search for him, a public meeting, finds out things he said on the record. Starmer then panics and tries to purge the guy. So Galloway has essentially been given an open goal in this election because Starmer's completely fucked it up, and he'll know that he's fucked it up as well, and he won't care because he still thinks he's going to win. I mean, he may still win when the election does come because the Tories are so despised. But I will repeat what I've said before, that the less of a majority any of the parties get, and the more chaotic we can make it, the better. The last thing we need is a strong government of either of the main parties or a strong coalition. We want something as weak as possible that can be more easily shoved around. Right, Jay says, I used to write for Politsturm and attend their online classes, but I felt I had to leave. Judging from their article on if Russia is imperialist or not, I don't blame you leaving them. Comrade Hello Hi says, Politsturm has some weird beliefs to the point where they support nothing. That's ultra-leftism for you. Basically declare everybody to be an imperialist, every war to be an inter-imperialist war, then declare that the only true action for a true communist is to sit and tweet, and that's it. Yuan, hello to you. Good to have you with us. Irish Partisan, I'll link to that Politsturm article below your comment there. Lertis says the summer offensive is a total mystery. It was announced publicly as if it were misinformation, but then it was carried out as described with predictable outcomes. Yeah, I still don't know what the fuck was going on with that, to be honest. I mean, they were trailing it as early as... Well, it was as soon as they had the success, well, the success in inverted commas when the Russians were, turned out to prove Strelkov right, where they didn't have enough forces for a larger operation and got caught out and knew they were going to get caught out, so withdrew, and they withdrew in good order from around Kharkov. And then, of course, the Ukrainians moved in and occupied it, and of course there was a big celebration and Zelensky was the hero. But after that, immediately after that, they announced they were going to have a go at the Zaporozhye direction. And they kept saying it over and over and over again. They kept saying it. We're coming, we're coming, we're coming. And to the point where, as Lertis says, it looked like it must have been a joke, or no, sorry, it must have been a deliberate leaked plan that wasn't real, a misguidance, a misinformation, an intelligence job, a psyop or something. But no, they just went exactly where they said they were going to go for 8 months previously, and they'd given the Russians almost a year to build up. They've given the Russians 9 months to build up a gigantic and very deep set of fortifications. And they did exactly what they said they were going to do in the exact area. I just don't know what the hell whoever planned that was thinking. Unless, of course, all of these people who planned this were on the same diet as Zelensky. That's possible. And that the NATO officers who apparently were doing the planning were so far gone on US and British propaganda that all they needed to do was to turn up in their amazing Leopard tanks, and the Russians would see them and go, "Oh no, is great German machine. We have no chance. We must run away, but not before we have stolen microchips from a washing machine." Well, did they think that that was going to be it? They seem to have done. Because I can't understand another reason why you would tell your enemy that where you're going for 8 and 9 months, give them the chance to build up a giant set of fortifications, and then attack on the ground through a densely packed minefield with no air cover at all, when the Russians were able to use their, I think it's the Ka-52 attack helicopters almost unrestrictedly. What are you doing? He's like, my military experience ended with my air rifle shooting badge in the age of 13 in the Boy Scouts, and even I know that's not a good idea, you know? I mean, even your average person who's played more than 2 games of Risk thinks that's a bad idea. So what on earth were these amazing NATO planners doing? Who knows? Maybe they're all deep cover Russian agents. Who knows? Hello to Slava, who's joining us, and I'm going to be doing... we're recording a program with Slava, who is, of course, on the Revolution Report, about the Putin speech and the various historical interpretations Putin made in that are, shall we say, subject to dispute. And we're going to be discussing that on Tuesday of this week, so tune in for that when it's up. Right, Tim Gray says, can you recommend any good books on North Korea? Know very little about its history, and what I have read is always anti-stuff. I do. Tim, can you indicate if you're on the Telegram group? Because I can post a lot of the stuff in there. Isidore says, hi Alex, would you consider giving a history of the various communist internationals and what we can learn from them today? Is there such an organization today, or why not? Do we need one? Well, we do need one. There's several who have laid claim to the title, and none of them live up to it. Yeah, I mean, I can do that. I mean, as to the fact that we need one now, clearly we do, and some ideas have been kicked around by comrades I'm in touch with and work with on that question. I think the World Anti-Imperialist Platform is a step towards it. If you're not familiar with that, be sure to do so. Make sure to make yourself familiar with it. But yes, a new international is needed. I think we're in the stages where we will be working towards it. But yes, I take your suggestion on board, Isidore. Guy, greetings to you in Brazil, I believe. President Jesus says, Boris's written rant was even worse than that video. It was like reading a high school kid who just discovered a thesaurus. That's what Boris always writes like. If you want to read a really bad book, and I mean bad in terms of writing, in terms of the mentality of it displays of the man who wrote it, read his biography of Churchill. It's one of the worst books I've ever read. It's juvenile. It gives away the mentality of the man who wrote it. Boris Johnson is a very unserious man. I mean, there's been plenty of unserious people in British bourgeois politics, of course, for many, many years. But I think even by the standards of British bourgeois politics, Boris Johnson is a deeply unserious individual. Like, David Cameron was an incompetent buffoon. Theresa May, same. Rishi Sunak, barely human. But Boris was the worst of them all because, like, all the things his enemies said about him inside the Conservative Party they were true, which is that he doesn't take anything seriously. Like, he is driven just simply by the passions, shall we say, in a very literal sense. Like, he's like driven by, like, he's a heavy drinker, heavy boozer, heavy eater of bad food, serial shagger, and he gives the impression of a man who is just completely unable to control himself. Apparently he's unable to pay attention to anything that doesn't interest him for more than a few seconds, like a sort of toddler with ADHD, a buffoon. And you read his writing and it's just like, you can't believe the amount of money that his parents spent on his education to produce somebody who apparently speaks several languages but is still incredibly stupid. There you go. Just goes to show you can't buy intelligence, even though you do try. I haven't read the written rant yet. President Jesus, I will do so. Rob says, it seems like British Prime Ministers don't get to make many decisions these days, at least none of any importance. Well, it's the same thing about American presidents. I mean, Lenin talked about it in as early as 1916, like the bureaucratization of capitalism and the bureaucratization of the state led to essentially a ruling class political operation that is entirely or almost entirely run by bureaucratic decision making. The prime minister's job is just a sign on the line. It becomes a problem if you have a prime minister who goes rogue and won't do exactly what they're told by the machine. So, like, again, I mentioned this. She's an idiot, and the shame of Yorkshire, seeing as it's a Yorkshireman asking the question. Liz Truss, like a complete fool, a reactionary buffoon who didn't know where the borders of Ukraine started and ended, even though she was nominally talking to Lavrov about that. But she stepped outside the acceptable bounds of policy, and therefore was disposed of via a deliberate market panic engineered by the governor of the Bank of England. So even for somebody who's like a complete reactionary tool, she was a bit too much of an independent thinker for these people. And we can go into bureaucratization in the future if there's an enthusiasm for it. Wayne says, what do you see the future of Russia post-Putin? Well, I don't. It's an interesting question, Wayne. I mean, at the moment, it's up in the air. I would say it depends very much on how this war is settled. And it depends also, of course, on the state of, on the strength of the class struggle inside Russia, which is, a lot of people don't pay attention to it, but of course it's there going on under the surface all the time, and there are various ways you can find out about it. Depends upon the solidity of the United Russia Party, which is very much a party that Putin and others in his group have put together to solidify their rule. Depends upon the economic developments, which is why we're doing another program on the Russian economy on Tuesday of this week. That'll be the live stream. I mean, my answer is going to be annoying because I'm not going to give you a clear one because I don't want to just do wild speculation on this. If they win this war convincingly, which they will now, and that again is largely thanks to the US imperialists refusing categorically to do any negotiations, they'll end up taking a gigantic amount of Ukraine, possibly including Kiev, maybe. I think there's no maybe about that. I think they will end up taking Kiev. So it depends upon if they can bring stability to that, which of course depends upon not just the strength of the Russian military and political institutions, but also are they going to be able to integrate the Ukrainian population that is left in old Ukraine into Russia? it seems that they probably will be able to do that. But again, like the role of the masses here can't be underestimated. So it'll be stable, I think, when Putin retires. From just a pride point of view, he will want to retire, leaving a stable regime in place and a successor who's going to, as he would see it, I think, take on the legacy that he leaves behind. But again, like the more you read about the economic setup in Russia, the more questions you have. And this is why I'm going to do another program on it. It's not an imperialist country, of course. That's very much the case. But it is a country still with a lot of contradictions inside of it. I think that some of those have been resolved in terms of when Biden and the Biden regime forced foreign capitalists to divest a lot of their holdings in Russia. Actually, some of the problems were inadvertently solved by them. The state sector in Russia, despite Putin doing the Russian government doing some privatizations last year that brought in quite a lot of money, has continued to grow in recent years. It now resembles, to a certain extent, though not to the exact degrees, the Chinese system of gigantic state-owned enterprises, but again with I would say a less stable political system than the Chinese, because the Chinese, for all the changes in the economy and the growth of the capitalist sector, they are, of course, maintaining a closer relationship with the masses than the Russian political leadership does, particularly the United Russia Party. So I'm going to basically just say that I think when they win the war and win it convincingly, it will leave behind a positive feeling amongst many Russians about Putin. This will probably be his last term coming up. He'll want to duck out, I think, before he gets too old. The warning that Biden poses there, though of course Biden was always a fucking dumbass even when he had all his brain. So I think that the regime will be stable in the short term, but again, a lot depends on like the class struggle within Russia itself, and I still do not know enough about that to be able to satisfactorily give you a comprehensive answer to that question. My immediate answer is that due to the fact that they will win the war, and due to the fact that some of the problems involving foreign influence, particularly US imperialist influence over some of the key industries in Russia that were still privately held, or at least traded on the stock market, even if they had a controlling influence from the Russian state, that problem has somewhat resolved itself. Again, until I know more about the exact state of class struggle in Russia, and the true strength of the Russian proletariat, which I still don't know enough about, I'm not going to give you an answer that I don't think that is going to be purely speculative. I will return to the question inevitably as we do more and more of these live streams. So Wayne, feel free to pose it to me again in a few weeks' time, because I will know more about the situation, about the Russian workers' movement, etc., in a few weeks' time. So I'm happy to return to it. If you notice, I do give these answers quite a bit, which is that if I'm not fully confident about something, I'm not just going to try and bullshit my way through the question. I'm going to say that I don't know enough, and then I'm going to return to it when I do. Okay, so Lim K says, Ukraine is a pathetic case. Zelensky is herding his own people to die for nothing. He is a puppet of NATO. Well, this is what happens when you have a comprador clique running your country, which is what Ukraine does. It's what Russia did for a long time as well. So again, like the positive role played by Lukashenko and others around him in Belarus must be emphasized here. And I will reflect on the fact that the world would be a better place if Slobodan Milosevic and his allies in Serbia and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, as it was, had succeeded in keeping Yugoslavia together. Had that the separatists not won out in Yugoslavia, the world would be a better place now. Certainly the Balkans would, but this is the way it plays out. we all made mistakes back in the 90s, and including those of us who were politically active at the very, very end of the 90s, as I was, falling for the anti-Milosevic bullshit. But had he succeeded, again, NATO might have taken a step back. Who knows? Anyway, more about Milosevic and Yugoslavia in future episodes. Slava says, judging by the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States, the hardcore nationalists welcomed Syrski because they don't mind meat grinder to continue, and liberal Ukrainian Americans are crying over Zelensky. That's interesting. That's interesting. Because the way in which it's being portrayed by sort of Russian sources is that it's Zelensky is the big-time Banderas, which I don't quite buy. Certainly he seems that if in the US that Syrski is now being welcomed because these so-called hardcore nationalists want to chuck more Ukrainians into a meat grinder, well, that says a lot about the so-called hardcore nationalists, doesn't it? All these people are hardcore servants of US imperialism. I mean, I think we should really stop using the term nationalist for these people, because there's nothing about the Ukrainian nation. The same is true for any nation which has groups like this within it, even my own. There's nothing about the Ukrainian nation that these people appear to particularly like very much. I mean, they're willing to see the whole thing go down in flames and hundreds of thousands, maybe millions killed. And for what purpose? Certainly not going to be for the purposes of damaging the Russian state. If anything, it's making the Russian state stronger. So what? For the glory of Joe Biden? For the glory of US imperialism? For what? For a mistaken belief in the romanticism of war? These people aren't nationalists because they clearly don't love the land. They clearly don't really love the people very much. And they clearly don't love much about the country, given that the vocal nationalists, both in the US and Britain and elsewhere, aren't even in it. So what is it that they love about this country they're called Ukraine? It's a baffling conundrum to me. What is it that they think they love so much? Right. Comrade Hello Hi says poor communities need CPG BML presence. And I completely agree with you. We are starting the process, though quite small, of building up in Manchester at the moment. So I will keep you updated as to how we're doing. Building up in Liverpool as well. I mean, we are starting from a comparatively low point, but this is the way you go. It's going to take a while for us to build ourselves up in working class communities, but this is the building of the red areas is what we must do. And if that takes a year or two to get up and running, then again, that we must embrace the hard work that will need to be done. But I am confident that we have the ability to do so. We have more and more good, dedicated comrades joining us all the time. We are building up our level of political understanding. We are training more people to be proper cadres in their areas. And more workers will turn towards the message of the party as events unfold in the catastrophic way in which they continue to do at the moment. So we are starting out, but we are in a good place to do so. And if you're in this country and you want to see us build up the organisation and you're not in it so far, be sure to come join us and help us build that presence. Help us build the red areas where you live. Right. The Maoist standard English speaker scares the British Trotskyist party. Maybe. Wouldn't describe myself as a Maoist, though. Irish Partisan asked the question, how long do you think until the Banderites flee Kiev and retreat to Lvov to set up their provisional government, which will be a NATO protectorate? That's an interesting question from Irish Partisan. Again, I'm doing guesswork here. There's several motivations here. They will want now, I think, to keep Zelensky in place. So, I mean, I know Poroshenko and co are apparently conspiring to have, I think Comrade Slava referred to him when I interviewed her last year as the chocolate oligarch due to his interest in the chocolate industry. Have the chocolate oligarch put back in power maybe, but I think the Americans will want some continuity. So they'll want to present the Lvov regime when it emerges as the true inheritor of the Great Maidan regime. So, and they'll want to present it as a victory. So the chances are that a lot of the Ukrainian decision makers are already in Lvov. So they don't even need to change location. Having Zelensky pop up in Lvov, what he may do is pop up there, form his provisional government, get declared to be a member of NATO and a member of the EU, thus, by the way, fatally destroying both organizations, or fatally damaging both organizations, I should say. So, and also bear in mind that the Americans will not want, even if they drop Biden and bring in American Psycho, and of course they got to dispose of Kamala as well. But if they bring in American Psycho, possibly they'll want a like-for-like replacement in some respects. They may bring in American Psycho with, of course, a female vice presidential nominee. And they'll want them to have a clear run. So even if they dump the war on Biden's head, they won't want Trump to be able to say, see what the Democrats delivered this horrible defeat before November. So what we may get, just thinking this through as I'm talking to you, is a move at the front which is similar to what they did before the big attempted offensives in autumn of 2022, which is that they threw all the older men, the people with disabilities, the people who weren't capable of fighting, they threw them into the line to defend and soak up Russian assaults, whilst at the same time they built up the army they used partially in Kherson region in 2022, which was where they were defeated, and then mostly in Kharkov. I think what they'll do now is Syrskyi will try to hold on the front lines whilst they build up a show army that will be based in the west of Ukraine, that won't be there to do any fighting. I'm told, I read the other day that they're still holding a lot of the best equipment in the west and some around Kiev. So all those Challenger tanks from the British, which aren't going to be deployed because like 2 of them got destroyed and it was very embarrassing for the British, they're holding them back along with apparently a few other things. So I think what they'll do is they'll put together some kind of force which will be presented as a Ukrainian army that is joining NATO. They will declare, I mean, eventually a lot of this hinges upon what the Russians do. We're assuming the Russians just keep grinding it out and don't go on the offensive. But if they're going to go on the offensive, of course, the chances are the Americans will pick up on it. So if the war continues at the current pace, or maybe if the Russians do go on the offensive, expect Zelensky and co to pop up in Lvov and declare that this western part of Ukraine, where of course Banderism is historically the strongest, there will be like a Banderistan declared around the regions of old Galicia, basically the old Polish and Austro-Hungarian parts of Ukraine, and they will declare that to be the real Ukraine, particularly if the Russians speed up their advance. And then there'll be a big photo call with Zelensky grinning away after his 10th line of coke, joining the EU. Certainly the EU will lean on everybody to accept that, even Orban, and Orban will, of course, accept it. Truth be told, there won't be a great deal he can do. He can't just continue vetoing these things. But it will, of course, mean the death of the EU. Putting this chaotic, deeply corrupt, reactionary statelet in there. And then, of course, once the Americans have got it into the EU and have got it over the line into NATO, they will then declare a great victory. They will not recognize Russian control over the rest of Ukraine. They will think to themselves that they've scored a great victory by forcing the Russians to take control over everywhere, including Kiev. Then they will start their counterinsurgency campaign, or their insurgency campaign, I should say, and then they will try to stick NATO forces in the Banderistan statelet. That will be their plan. I think that the Russians will probably react to that by saying, okay, we'll have it. and will then just sit back and watch. Because now even Orban has come out and said today that the time of the West is over. And that's a guy who started his career, his political career. Well, originally he started off in the ruling party in the People's Democracy of Socialist Hungary. That's where he started. Then he flipped to, of course, being a Soros guy for a while, regime changer as a younger man. Then he became then he was sort of middle of the road nationalist type. Now he's this sort of Hungarian revanchist character, but who's got more of a political base and is a lot more politically intelligent than other characters in Eastern Europe. And he's not in the Euro, of course. So he's able to say certain things that others will not. But if even he has concluded that, well, this thing's over, and you notice how Hungary is pursuing more and more deals with China, Vietnam, and other countries in Southeast Asia. And, of course, they have maintained their relationship with the Russians. So they clearly know that things are moving towards the end for the EU. The admittance of Banderistan, so to speak, will probably speed up that end game. And ultimately, the victory that the American imperialists will probably want to declare if things go pear-shaped slightly before the American presidential election, maybe. So like October time, perhaps, they'll declare, look, Ukraine's in NATO, just don't show the map. Look, it's Zelensky. Look, he's in NATO. Look, he's in the EU. Look, he's had an unfortunate heart attack by the pool at his villa in Florida. What a shame. That all done with great fanfare before the presidential election, in order to give the impression of victory, to boost whoever takes over from Biden, be it American Psycho or whoever else it might be. So that would my timeline would be that it would be October of this year, probably September or October of this year, depending upon the speed of the Russian advance, depending upon if the Ukrainian forces can keep the resistance going until then. As to how they then handle things, a lot of this depends upon the fact that the Russians get a vote in this. But that's just, I think that would be their plan if the Lvov statelet is their outcome. I think that that is the only rational outcome that they can present as a win now is the Lvov Bandera statelet. I mean, it'll be about as corrupt and as disgusting as Kosovo, which is, of course, an American protectorate, and they'll look to immediately stick it in NATO and stick as many NATO forces in there as possible, and again say, hey, Ukraine's in NATO. So September or October, I think, would be then depending upon what the Russian forces do as well. Hold me to that. If it goes wrong, I will address the reasons why my guesswork was wrong. Another cunning plan, says Albert Roundtree. Mary says Alex's Russian accent is Neil Patrick Harris's Stefano. I have no idea who any of those people are. Is that the guy from How I Met Your Mother? Wasn't he in Starship Troopers? Remind me of that if I'm wrong about it. Tom says based. Okay. Tim, yeah, email me and I will send you a myriad of DPRK reading material. The Royalist in Exile says the West have ultimately become the propaganda machine they have accused the USSR Russia of being. The question is, will the people of the West recognize that their government is lying to them? It's an interesting question from Royalist in Exile. I am reminded of the words of the great Soviet Marxist psychologist Evald Ilyankov when he made an observation that Orwell's 1984 was in effect a coded confession of sorts. It was in actual fact he was talking about the West rather than the USSR, and that's absolutely true. If I remember reading 1984, again, this was a number of years ago now, and it was when he's describing the scene where the agitator is making a dramatic point about how we've always been at war with what's it called? Oceania has always been at war with whatever the hell the other continent is called. I've forgotten it now. We've always been at war with Lusitania, whatever the fuck it is. Westeros, throwing in a Game of Thrones reference there. And the agitator is addressing this crowd with wild, mad gestures, and then he gets a message in his ear, and he immediately declares that we've always been at war with another continent, and the message changed and the crowd goes wild. That's Britain today. That was not the Soviet Union. And the other thing, very interesting thing, in fact, I may reread 1984 now I've read Ilyenkov's quotation on that. Where he describes how the various departments of the party deal with culture. And I think this is a very interesting confession, because he describes the production of culture for the masses as prole feed. And it's this sort of disgusting, degraded culture that he's fed to the working class. And that's how he sees, Orwell sees the provision of culture in the Soviet Union, which is, of course, completely historically incorrect. The Soviet Union tried to raise the cultural and education level of the working class. It was, even by the admission of the United Nations, who was studying cultural levels in the early 1950s, the USSR had one of the most educated and cultured workforces in the world, because things like classical music, opera, what's regarded as like highbrow literature, were read and listened to as a standard thing in working class households in the Soviet Union. They weren't ever in the United States or Britain. So if we're talking about a coded confession made by Orwell, the whole thing about prole feed, this disgusting department that dealt with lowbrow degenerate culture, and even made sort of state-approved pornos. Well, that's the United States. That's Hollywood. That's the British entertainment industry. So it is a coded confession. Everything that he said, Orwell said, was meant to be a satire of the Soviet Union, was actually much more about Britain and the United States than it ever was about the USSR. A coded confession, if you will. As to Royalists and Exiles' question, I think this has to be addressed on a number of levels, which is that it is people know on various different levels that they've been lied to about various different things. So there's the question of COVID. I mean, whatever opinion you here in the chat might take on that. A lot of people suspected that the governments weren't being straight with them, and they were right. They weren't. There are a lot of people that the governments weren't telling the truth about how effective the vaccine was, and they were right. The governments weren't telling them the truth about that. The fact that the situation was manipulated to suit wealthy and powerful interests, a lot of people woke up to that during COVID, and that was 100% correct. More people, or a slightly different group of people, woke up to the reality of the fact they've been lying non-stop about what's going on in Ukraine. This Gaza thing, this slaughter that the Israelis are committing with the full support of Britain and the United States, again, that's causing a lot of, especially younger generations, to wake up to the realities of the propaganda system. And this is why they're getting worried. They're getting worried because different groups of people who have identified themselves as being on various different points in the political spectrum are all saying now that the media is a giant lie machine. The politicians don't represent anything. The institutions are all corrupt or useless. And that's being said by people who describe themselves as ultra-conservative traditionalists, and, of course, us who have always said many of these things, who are communists. So they know they've got a problem. So all they've got left is repression and lies. And eventually, well, not quite. Maybe I'm not being quite accurate there. There's still the capacity of the United States and the British and the French and the Germans to cling on, because they've got an awful lot of capital behind them still, even though they are weakening. So what is true, though, is that the institutions are very fragile, and the state's rule is a lot less secure than it appears to be. So it's only really inertia that keeps it in place. A solid shove from any direction could cause chaos. So again, it's just a matter of when the inertia breaks, and it will, which goes back to the point we were discussing earlier about the need to build the Communist Party as an organization across the country, about the need for a raise in the level of class consciousness, because otherwise chaos invites a reactionary response. So the time is coming. It will, of course, always catch out everybody when it does. Because what happens is, of course, in the minds of the masses, frustrations pile on frustrations. Most people in most countries are busy trying to look after their families, thinking that if they just keep their heads down and get on with things, that the crisis will pass, and eventually they'll start receiving pay rises again, which enable them to meet their living costs and perhaps have a short holiday once a year or twice a year, and keep clothes on their children's backs, etc. And there'll be a point reached when suddenly the accumulation of frustrations reaches a point where it just boils over, and that point can come over things that are seemingly very small and nobody expects. Even those of us who spend our time looking for it won't expect it. Did Lenin expect that the February Revolution would begin with a riot on International Women's Day, a bread riot staged by working class women? Probably not. He probably thought something was coming, but nobody knows exactly when it's going to happen. So to finish Royalists in Exile's question, it will come, and I think it will probably come sooner than we think. Everything is there that will mean chaos and disaster for the ruling class, or at least severe danger for them. The question is not whether it will come. It always does. The question is, are we properly placed to respond to it? Who is the most developed political force that can lead a movement that will seize the moment, that will pick up the power that falls into the street? At the moment, it's not us. We must be honest about that. Comrade Hello Hi says, I think ICOR is more cool with the World Anti-Imperialist Platform than the IMCWP. It has parties from both, though. Okay. Videos Del Mundo says that musical interlude was a bit much. Well, that is a playlist that the people demanded. Lim K says, what do you think about the Tucker Carlson Putin interview? There's a whole video on that under the live section of the YouTube channel. I did an hour or so on it the other day. I won't rehash the point here. So go away and watch that, and feel free to return with questions, of course. Irish Partisan says, what are the differences between the various communist parties in Britain? CPB, revisionists. CPGBML, my party, so I'm obviously going to say the best. CPBML, pseudo-Maoists who have a fundamentally incorrect interpretation of in what imperialism is, and that has led them to conclusions that are supportive of bourgeois British nationalism. I can say more about that if necessary. CPGB, Provisional Central Committee. I didn't even know who they are, to be completely honest with you. CWO, NCPB, RCG UK, and RCPBML. RCG, Revolutionary Communist Group, they're a Trotskyite organization who don't mention Trotsky anymore. RCPBML, I'm not familiar with. CWO, I'm not familiar with. New Communist Party of Britain, they were a split from the original CPGB. I don't think they do a great deal these days. I think I've met some of them. They all seem like decent guys, but there's not a lot. They don't have a lot going on, I don't think. So that's my very brief answer to your question, Irish Partisan. If you want more detail, let me know. I can. Someone else has asked me for a critique of some of these organizations, so I may go further into it. Lertis says the most likely successor at this point is another run for Medvedev. Possibly. You got to wonder, though, about how he's going to deal with... maybe he will, and maybe the fact that he's been basically just calling the rest of the so-called Western international community a bunch of cunts for the last year won't actually matter, because the Russians won't have much to do with them anyway. Lim K says Russia will probably be Russian at full strength, whoever takes over from Putin. Well, it'll certainly be stronger than it was in 2022, that's for sure. CPB, Revisionist Party, that's correct. C. Bolt says, start in Murdy, South Wales. They called it Little Moscow during the miners' strike. Good pointer. Thank you very much. Dan Lindstrom, Diana Johnson, Fool's Crusade, Daranas Korstag is highly rated book in Sweden. Okay, I will make a note of that. Hello to Dingo Waitman Baby, who says, hi, Comfam. Frank says, please, your input on American election mess. I do not think it is important. I do not think it is as important for the world as the Western media makes it. You know what? I'm going to have... we're hitting the hour and a half mark. So what I'm going to do, Frank, I will do an election special. Not just about the election, but about how important it is. I'll put that in the diary for some point. Eurasia and East Asia, Comrade Hello Hi. Yes, it's a long time since I read that book. Hello from Massachusetts, says Lisa. I can't see young people going off to war when they've been encultured with in gross individualism, said Albert. I don't know, Albert. I mean, at the moment, no. But this is why the ruling class in the imperialist countries have a need for fascism. Fascism provides them with both a fake revolution and a fake sense of collectivity, collective endeavor. And a lot of young people, and I include myself when I was 20 years younger or so, when I was still like in my late teens, early 20s, a lot of young people will respond to the idea of a collective endeavor, of the chance for heroism. Not all of them by any means, but I think the fake revolution that fascism brings, we're reaching the point where it will become necessary for the ruling class in imperialist countries to consider that. Of course, they only will go for it fully when the working class reaches a point of challenging them that they need the fascists. But we're approaching the point where that may become a problem. The USSR didn't have the Beatles. Pittsburgh dude, I'm assuming you're making a joke there. Yeah, as Albert's point below makes clear, look, we vastly overstate the influence of like Western culture and vastly overrate it, to be blunt. I mean, the Soviet culture and the culture promoted in the Eastern Bloc countries, like the idea that that was in any way inferior to what was being put out here is a joke, quite frankly. And as I said in the conversation I had recently with Donald Coulter of the Revolution Report, what we were given in the West was like this corporate form of entertainment. And you were given the right, you might have had no control over your life whatsoever, but you were given the right to be entertained. And that was what the 60s ultimately gave you. Full 1984 on YouTube. I don't really like the film, to be honest. Didn't Russia allege that COVID was a bioweapon, says President Jesus? Yes, they did. I'm still in two minds about that. I don't have the full report in front of me. So it's not an unreasonable assumption, given the fact that we know that the US imperialists have engaged in a lot of biological weapons research off the books. In Ukraine, they've got biolabs in Armenia, in Kazakhstan. The governments of all those countries should be asked questions about that. And of course, the lab in Wuhan, which was run by or funded by the National Institutes of Health from the United States. So here's a big question for the Chinese government, which nobody appears to want to ask, which is, well, what the hell was it doing there? I can guess, which is that the Chinese thought that by making these concessions and allowing the Americans to open up such a laboratory or co-fund such a laboratory there, that they were building more positive relations with them. How wrong they were. George Galloway raid, says Jenny. Can you elaborate? Good afternoon to you, Jenny, by the way. Royalist in Exile said, excellent answer to my question, Alexander, thank you. The playlist is staying exactly where it is, Albert. Do not fret. Though the contents of the playlist may change. Dan Lindstrom, question for today. In what way is Grover historically right and or wrong on Stalin? Well, Dan, you really do drop these... drop the big ones late in the day, don't you? Tell you what, that's one for another day. email it to me at the address in the description box, and we'll pick this up at another time, because it is an important question. No part of Ukraine should be allowed into NATO, says Harry Price. Russia should keep to their red line. They have total air dominance over all of Ukraine. Yes, they do, Harry, and you raise an interesting point there. My question is that, Putin has said different things about this, as has Medvedev, as have others in the Russian political establishment. The question is, do they then, if it's the case that they set up Banderistan in Lvov, which Putin has said they have no interest in, and they've invited Poland and Hungary to essentially take it over, Hungary to take over Transcarpathia and Poland to take over Old Galicia. Are they then going to look at that and say, well, you know what? Have it. Knowing full well that it will cost a fucking bomb for the Europeans especially to maintain. Because the Americans, especially if Trump wins, won't be funding that thing. That it will be a massive destabilizing influence in NATO and the EU, both of which the Russian leadership seems, at the moment anyway, to be done with. Will they then look at that and say, you know what, have it? We'll set up the border at the line of the old Russian Empire as it stood in 1914, and you can have Banderistan in the EU, and we'll see how it goes. Who knows? Maybe some in the Russian leadership will look at that and think, well, it'll poison the EU and NATO like a nasty dose of lead. It's clearly part of their thinking. So I understand your point, but they've said different things on this in the past, Harry. Medvedev tweets are king. Yeah, his tweets are always very entertaining, even if I find a lot of things in them to disagree with. George Galloway live stream just ended and some of us are pouring in from there. Oh, okay. Wayne says, I have profound issues with Dugin. Do you have any idea what level of influence he has in Russia? Not as much as he thinks. To what degree does he represent broad sentiment? I don't think he does. His recent comment, we need a party like China, seems remarkable. It's because he's an idealist. He was, and his attitude to communism seems to change almost by the day. I think with him, I appreciate his insights on things like Hegel. I always read his philosophical investigations. I think he's a damn sight more interesting than any philosopher in the West, even though his political conclusions are always idealist and a lot of them are reactionary, and I don't have much time for them. But I think if someone like him goes to China and sees what's been done there, and he sees also, he's praised North Korea and the DPRK before, and he's praised Juche before. So he seems to be politically all over the place. Who knows? I think basically he wants a sort of Russified version of Juche or something. Which, again, I don't think he understands the process by which the Chinese and the Russian system, Chinese and the DPRK system emerged, to be honest. I think he just likes things that are based. He seems to be a bit influenced by, internet memes as well. So, as I always say with Dugin, interesting man, interesting writing, politically just all over the place, and I don't put much, don't set much store by his political pronouncements. Can we get a live stream on the various communist groups one day? One day you can, just not this week. Does anyone in the UK give a damn about the Super Bowl? No. Well, no, that's not fair. I don't, personally, President Jesus, but some weird people in the south of England probably do. There's a lot of American exiles here who hold Super Bowl parties. Do you think the Russian Federation will take Odessa? Asked Lisa. Yes, I do. I think they'll take the entirety of the coast. Thus also tempting, of course, Romania to try and take Bessarabia and other bits that they used to have back in the day. So, okay, this brings us to 9:30 of the evening in Britain, and I'm going to bring things to a close here. Thank you to everybody who's contributed to what is another very interesting discussion in the chat this evening. Always good to see as many of you here and active as there is. Be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already, and the audio of this will be up on Patreon tomorrow morning. Thank you to everybody, and I'll throw you back over to your communist mixtape.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.
عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش في ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار، وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني